It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The year is 1918. The guns are silent now. The Great War is over. An armistice has been declared. When we grew up, most of us at least, we used to call it Armistice Day. Now we call it Veterans Day. That's why we're here today, to honor the American veteran. There are many dates throughout our history that signify the start of an American war, the end, or a significant event in between. The shot heard round the world, 19 April 1775, Lexington and Concord, the beginning of the American Revolution. For the first 6 years, it did not always go well for America. Battles were lost, morale was low, desertion rate was high. And then the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, General George Washington, made a bold move. He marched his troops from New York and New Jersey to Yorktown, Virginia, site of a large British port and garrison. The siege was on. My wife Margie and I have been privileged to visit Yorktown, Virginia, and it was a thrill for me to walk over the very same terrain where General Washington deployed his artillery and his infantry. And we stood on a deck overlooking the very field where General Washington accepted the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. It was the beginning of the end for the British. But they didn't learn their lesson, and they came back for more in the War of 1812. And in 1814, an American lawyer went aboard a British warship to secure the release of an American prisoner. That warship and others were in Baltimore Harbor, and all night long they shelled the American fort overlooking Baltimore Harbor. And in the morning, that American lawyer looked out and he saw the American flag was still flying over Fort McHenry. And Francis Scott Key wrote a poem. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light." That poem, of course, was later set to music and later became our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, some Americans complain that the Star-Spangled Banner is too bellicose, too warlike. And others complain that the range of notes makes it difficult to sing. Well, for this veteran, our Star-Spangled Banner is difficult to sing because of the lump in my throat. And then there was the Mexican-American War. And although it is but a footnote in history, 5 young American officers fought together in the Battle of Veracruz. And those 5 young officers, years later, would make the most important decision of their lives. By 1861, America was being torn apart. War was imminent. Those 5 young officers, by now, are all generals. George McClellan and Ulysses S. Grant stayed with the Union forces and fought for the North in the war between the states. And James Longstreet, Thomas Jackson, and Robert E. Lee went with the South, seceding from the Union. And friends fought against friends, brothers against brothers, fathers against sons in the Civil War. Took almost 4 years. 700,000 Americans lost their lives fighting for America. And in the end, to add further irony to the story, 2 former friends from that Battle of Veracruz met at Appomattox Courthouse, and General Lee surrendered his sword to General Grant. The next war was minor by comparison, the Spanish-American War. But it's important to note here that the core of the officer cadre and the enlisted would later be called to go and fight with the armed American Expeditionary Force in Europe for the Great War. It was called the Great War in 1917 and 1918 for Americans because There was not a World War II, so how could that be World War I? But all that ended on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Every American knows that date. But how many recognize 25 June 1950? I know some of you do. That's the day that North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. And once again, American veterans picked up arms to go to the defense of a beleaguered nation. But who can say when the Vietnam War started for Americans? No one. There was no revolutionary event. It was rather an evolutionary timeline, a continuum. Some will say America's involvement actually started in Vietnam as early as 1945. The Japanese surrendered to end World War II, and they evacuated French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And then the French came back in to recolonize with American aid. And for the next 9 years, from 1945 to 1954, the Viet Minh, precursor to the Viet Cong, fought the French. And one by one, they picked off French outposts, French forts, until the French were down to their last bastion of hope at Dien Bien Phu. Once again, massive American aid poured into the French in a losing effort. And the French left Indochina, and they left all the problems to America. In the later 1950s and early 1960s, American advisors were sent to Vietnam. Once again, we're getting deeper into this situation. And in 1964, President Johnson signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing retaliation against North Vietnamese sites by air and naval gunfire. For me, there are 3 dates that are significant for me regarding Vietnam. In the spring of 1965, I was stationed in Quantico, Virginia, and unless we were out on a night exercise, we'd sit around in the evening and discuss the possibility or the probability of our going to Vietnam someday. On 8 March 1965, U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang. The words possibly and probably were no longer in our vocabulary. We would be going to Vietnam. The second date that has impacted my life regarding Vietnam was the night of 31 January 1968. A truce had been declared between the NVA and the VC on one side, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, and the ARVN on the other side, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. It was for an opportunity for the Vietnamese troops to go home and celebrate their Lunar New Year. South Vietnamese troops went home. North Vietnamese troops did not. For over a year, North Vietnamese had planned this operation. There were 2 schools of thought in North Vietnam at the time among the military hierarchy. On the one hand, the Tet Offensive would be so massive in scope, so meticulously planned, that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would easily overrun South Vietnamese cities, villages, and hamlets. And the citizenry of South Vietnam would force the government to capitulate, to sue for peace. But on the other hand, what to do about the Americans? Now, just by coincidence, if one believes in coincidences, this article appeared in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune last month. I don't expect you to read it from there. And then 3 days later, a brief letter to the editor appeared. I'd like to read the letter to the editor to you. As a former Marine infantry officer and Vietnam veteran, allow me to add an asterisk to your October 5th headline, Communist leader defeated both French and Americans. Although General Vo Nguyen Giap was the architect who beat the French militarily. He did not defeat Americans militarily. He did defeat America politically. It is a myth that American forces in Vietnam lost the war in Vietnam. We lost the American media and subsequently the American public. And at what cost? Over 58,000 names are on the Vietnam War Memorial. Margie and I have been to visit the Vietnam War Memorial, and with strips of paper and pencil, we have rubbed over some of those names, friends of mine, who were killed in action. 4 of them, good friends. Ralph Hines thought he was going to be Commandant of the Marine Corps someday. Those of us who knew him thought, well, perhaps he'll make general, but probably not commandant. Ralph never got past captain. Richard Hatch was aboard a helicopter that was shot down over South Vietnam. He was the only survivor. He wished that he had not been. It took 4 days to get his wish. He had third-degree burns over 90% of his body. MacRae Tuttle sounds like a rather aristocratic name. We just called him Mac. Mac came from quite a well-to-do family. His goal in the Marine Corps was to serve as an infantry officer, to gain leadership experience, go home, and take over his dad's business. I don't know who took over the soft drink bottling business in Cincinnati, Ohio, but it wasn't my friend Mac. Jerry Woodall was my best friend in the Corps. Jerry was a very senior captain, ready to make major. But Jerry thought even though he was halfway home to retirement, he'd probably serve his 13-month tour in Vietnam, get out, and marry that special girl waiting for him. And they would get married and build a house in Tustin, California, and have orange trees on the property. I don't know who married that special girl waiting in Tustin, California. I hope that he was as good as Jerry, but he sure wouldn't have been better. But there are not 4 names on here, there are 5. I'll never forget the shock of picking up the Stars and Stripes newspaper one day in 1968, looking over the list of casualties, and there it was. Patrick P. Murray, Captain, United States Marine Corps, MIA. Not KIA, killed in action, but MIA, missing in action. Pat grew up in St. Paul, graduated from St. Thomas College. We rode the bus together from Washington, D.C. to Quantico, Virginia for OCS. Upon graduation from OCS, Pat and I were roommates for the next 6 months while at the basic school. We ate in the mess hall together. We shared sea rations together in the field. We patrolled together. We fixed bayonets and charged hills together. And if you want to count sharing the same fighting hole in a defensive night position, Pat and I even slept together. At the end of 6 months, our MOS was determined, our military occupational specialty. I chose infantry. Pat said, you know, I've had enough of this rolling around in the mud stuff. He didn't really say stuff. So Pat went to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. He became an RIO, a radar intercept officer in an A-6 Skyhawk jet. Now I'm going to fast forward 5 years, from 1968 to 1973. And on Valentine's Day, our prisoners of war returned from North Vietnamese prison camps. For 5 years, My head said, Pat isn't coming home. But my heart still held out hope. It was not to be. Now I'm going to fast forward another 28 years, from 1973 to 1991. On 9/11, evil and terror struck America. And young patriots put everything else on hold. Their academic plans, their vocational plans, maybe even their marital plans, and signed up to serve in the United States Armed Forces. And now an editorial comment, these people are stronger, tougher, smarter, better educated, better trained, and better prepared for the mission at hand than were we, the veterans of earlier times. And I would like to acknowledge two of them here this morning. One isn't here. Well, the other one isn't either, but he will be represented. Joe Pyram grew up right here in Eden Prairie. Graduated from Eden Prairie High School, joined the United States Marine Corps. Was deployed twice, first to Iraq and the second time to Afghanistan. And Joe was severely wounded in Afghanistan, came home to face 6 major surgeries, and in his words, some plastic surgery. But Joe didn't sit back and feel sorry for himself. Went to Normandale College, got his degree in law enforcement. And Joe isn't here today because now he's at Augsburg College. He wants to get his bachelor's degree, and he still wants to serve his country by being a police officer. I think we should let Joe know what we think about him. Thank you. Sam Stender, like Joe Pyram, grew up in Eden Prairie. Graduated from Holy Family Catholic School, but Sam wanted to be a Marine officer. So he went on to St. Norbert's College in Wisconsin and got his degree. Came back, worked hard, was accepted to officer candidate school, and then served his time at the basic school. And then he was assigned to 29 Palms Base, California, where he joined 2-7, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment. And last year, 2-7 deployed to Afghanistan. And then last April, 2-7 returned. And Sam contacted his parents and said, you know, I'm coming home on leave shortly anyway. Don't bother to come out to California for the welcoming home ceremony. Margie and I were already in Southern California, and we said, we'll serve as surrogate parents for the day, and we'll go out and welcome First Lieutenant Sam Stender and 2-7. What a difference a war makes. There was a sea of red waiting for those Marines and Navy corpsmen. And when they got off those buses, the cheer from other Marines stationed at 29 Palms and friends and relatives reinforced my feeling I'm very proud to be a United States Marine. Sam is in 29 Palms today. He couldn't be here, but his parents are here. Pat and Scott Stender, would you please stand? And now if you are a United States Army veteran, would you please stand? Thank you for your service. United States Navy veterans. Thank you for your service. United States Air Force veterans. Thank you for your service. Are there any Coast Guard veterans here today? Thank you for your service. And if you are a United States Marine, would you please stand? Those of you seated think I'm probably going to say thank you for your service. Semper Fidelis, Marine, always faithful. I would like to close with a statement that's been going around the internet for a number of years now, author unknown. It's especially popular this time of the year, just before Veterans Day. It is the veteran, not the preacher, who gives us freedom of religion. It is the veteran, not the reporter, who gives us freedom of the press. It is the veteran, not the poet, who gives us freedom of speech. It is the veteran, not the campus organizer, who gives us the right to assemble. It is the veteran, not the lawyer, who gives us the right to a fair trial. It is the veteran, not the politician, who gives us the right to vote. Thank you, veterans. And for those of you seated who are not acknowledged today, thank you for coming and paying honor to the American veteran.